It's July 28th, 2016. My name is John Rodriguez, volunteer with the Hanford branch of the Kings County Library Volunteer History Project. Would you please state your full name?
My name is Gary Sanger, S-A-N-G-E-R.
Okay, Gary, and where are you from?
Originally, I'm from Greece, New York, currently living in Hanford.
Are your parents still with us?
Now, unfortunately, my parents, both of them died 5 years ago, 3 months apart.
Sorry. And what did they do for a living?
My father was a machinist, my mother was a waitress, a secretary, various and sundry jobs.
And you have siblings?
I have 3 brothers and 1 sister. I'm the oldest.
And their ages?
Dan is going to, he just turned 60 years old. Ray, 58 years old, Mary, 56, and Tom, 54.
Did any of them serve?
Ray followed me into the Air Force. I got out in 72, he went in 76.
And what did you do for serving?
I was a high school student, and so I enlisted basically a few months after I graduated from high school.
I see. Let's talk about the early days in your service, in your military service. What branch did you serve in?
I was in the Air Force.
And you enlisted?
As I enlisted.
In what year?
I enlisted on December 6, 1968.
What inspired you to join that
Well, I
particular
was
branch?
always interested in aviation, space. I figured the Air Force was the best way to fulfill my dreams.
Yeah. And how was the boot camp experience?
It was an experience, I'll put it that way. It's not something I would want to repeat voluntarily, but I survived.
How were the first few days of that?
Well, I enlisted on a Friday, so the first weekend was basically just getting to know the other people on the platoon. And then following Monday, they threw us immersion style into basic training.
And how was, let's talk about military life and adjusting to it.
It was quite a change because you lived in open bay barracks, and the food was, if you ever had military food, you know it's nothing to write home about, especially back in those days.
Yeah.
The green eggs were common, the chlorinated water and powdered eggs.
So it wasn't the best, wasn't your...
It wasn't 4-star cuisine, no. I'm sure it qualified as 2-star cuisine.
Just, did you receive any specialized training?
No, basic training was about the same for everybody, and then after we graduated basic, we went off to technical school, and that's when we got our specialized trainings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's touch on some of the wartime experiences. Where were you deployed?
I was stationed at Cameron Bay in Vietnam as a coastal Air Force base.
And what year was that?
I arrived in July of 70 and left in July 71.
See, we're talking about your military friendships.
Well, one of my regrets is that most of the people who I served with, I've lost contact with over the years. Several have passed on, unfortunately. I do see some of the people I served with in Vietnam on an annual basis at reunions.
So you keep in touch with them through that?
Just at the reunions.
Are there any websites that you go on to help you with finding some of these people?
No.
No, you haven't.
To be honest, I've forgotten most of the names.
And how did you stay in contact with friends and family?
Well, to family, it was just basically through mail. That was way back before social media. There was no internet, no Facebook, no Twitter. So you had your one phone call every few months with the USO. Otherwise, it's basically just mail. And you had the free postage, luckily. But even then, trying to compress everything down into one sheet of paper to fold up and mail off.
It's a lot of letter writing.
Definitely. I learned to write small. Look at some of the old letters I wrote. You need a magnifying glass to read them.
Are there any specific memories about your service, your time?
Well, interesting deployment to Vietnam. Because basically, I was originally supposed to go to Vung Tau, which was on the southern tip of Vietnam. And so I get to Tan Son Nhut Airport, which is just outside Saigon. That's where all the incoming military arrive at. And I just missed the plane that day to Vung Tau. There's only 2 flights a week. It's on a Wednesday. Next flight's not till Saturday. So here I am spending my first 2 days in Vietnam in transient airman's quarters. Then I finally get to Vung Tau, only to be told, you get on this plane, you're going to Cam Ranh Bay, because boarders were chasing me across the oceans trying to divert me. It didn't arrive in time. So I get to Cam Ranh Bay, it's about 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday night. They ask me where I am, I give them, show my orders, explain I went to Vung Tau like I was supposed to. They said, you're supposed to be diverted, and I said, I don't have any orders diverting me. So apparently it wasn't all that uncommon because the sergeant at Cam Ranh Bay knew somewhat what was going on. So they give me a billet in my barracks, and 2 days later, Monday morning, I'm reporting for duty.
Wow.
And then I was a corrosion control specialist, which means we looked at the aircraft for corrosion in the saltwater environment, because, like I said, it's a coastal facility. Also, prep the ground equipment for maintenance. And in March of '71, I was working a line shack at the south end of the base, repairing equipment by stripping paint off for repairs and inspection. And we had shut down early that day. I got permission to close down early because there was a church function at the base chapel I wanted to go to. And so we're just starting the function, and here the mortars start landing. Right down at the south end of the base, where I would have been.
Wow.
And luckily, the mortars caused, the official report says no damage, but they were looking for structural damage that needed to be repaired. There was just a couple of shrapnel hits on the building that I worked out of, and that's about it. But they were in the wrong spot at the wrong time.
So that goes without saying that your plant was close to the fighting.
And we were on one side of Cam Ranh Bay, the VC were on the other side, and they were mortaring periodically. They were trying to get the fuel depot that was used by the 3 services, Army, Navy, and Air Force. And they finally did about a month after I got back to the States.
Would you like to speak about any of your wounded or fallen comrades?
Well, one of the things about being at the base chapel was as part of the hospital annex, and you got to see the wounded come in, and it really brought the war home to you.
Let's talk about when the war ended and coming home. Where were you when the war came to an end?
Well, after I left Vietnam, I still had a year and a half to go in my enlistment, so they sent me to Dover, Delaware. So I finished up my enlistment, got out in December of '72. I was not really happy with being a corrosion control specialist. I've been doing something a little bit less hazardous, because we were working with all sorts of chemicals, which actually geared back in the '70s wasn't quite like they have it these days. I stayed in longer. In fact, there are times I would regret not having stayed in longer. But when the Vietnam War, the ceasefire happened a month after I got out, January of '73. Then the fall of Saigon was 2 years later. I was in college at the time when they had all the footage of the communists taking over Saigon and the mass evacuation of the U.S. Embassy.
And you were out in '72, you said?
At the end of '72.
At the end of '72. And you would have re-enlisted, correct?
Well, if I was doing something else, I probably would have.
Yeah. What was the reception like when you came home?
Other than the neighbors, most of whom who had served in World War II, it was pretty much, who cares? We were pretty much ignored. The American Legion never really contacted me. VFW never really contacted me about joining. We were the people who lost the first war for the United States.
So there was almost an air of indifference, it sounds like.
Yeah, a difference or a disdain, or even though the military in Vietnam won every single engagement that we were in, politically the war was lost and we had a stigma attached to us.
You gonna elaborate on some more of that?
Well, some of the stories you hear about people being spat on, called baby killers, there was some of that by some of the more radical students.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't as widespread as some of the people made it out to be at the time, but it was there. And like I said, some of the older veterans, the ones who didn't know me, just tried to say, oh, who's he? My neighbors, though, my relatives, and an uncle, one of my uncles was a Marine, fought in the Pacific Campaign. He was proud of my service. He was proud of my brother's service, too.
Yeah. Must have been difficult coming home to something such as that.
Well, pretty much I was pretty much withdrawn at that point because just getting out of the service, transitioning back, it proved to be a little bit harder than I had anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went through myself, political mood changes, went from strong conservative to strong liberal and back to somewhat conservative viewpoints.
Yeah, I mean,
To this day, I'm sure not exactly sure why my political life swung in such a way over the few years after I got out before it settled down.
we just went into that next question. As far as readjustment to civilian life, you touched on that before this interview, and you touched on it now, that it was difficult for you.
And to a degree it was. I mean, I had the support of my family, which is very grateful. But you go from a very regimented life to an unregimented life. You have all this freedom that you didn't have. You're trying to get back to what it was before you were enlisted, basically. And it's not all easy to do at times.
Mm.
But I had a couple months of downtime, then went to college, used the GI Bill, got my bachelor's degree, and actually saved up enough money for the first year of graduate school. Of course, living at home helped considerably.
Outstanding. Did you stay in contact with any of your fellow veterans?
Well, at the time, no, but after I got to Hanford, the American Legion contacted me and I joined, worked my way up through the ranks as an officer, belonged to the local VFW post here, even though I don't go to the meetings as often as I do American Legion meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way I do keep in contact with the various veterans organizations, veterans of Hanford and Kings County.
All right. And what life lessons or observations did you gather from your experiences?
Well, one is that never take anything for granted. I mean, the bit when the mortar shell impacted near the shack I was supposed to be at was kind of a life-altering experience because it made me realize I was supposed to have been there at the time. And somebody was watching out for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, don't take anything for granted and take the most of the opportunities that are presented to you. Like I said, I parlayed the GI Bill into a bachelor's degree, 1 year grad school. And And then I used the veterans points to get employment with the National Weather Service. That's how I ended up here in Hanford. He spent 20 years working at the forecast office here in town. And I retired last year, and now not doing much of anything other than working with the veterans groups, American Legion, Kings County Veterans Employment Committee.
And you find this work satisfying?
That's because we're helping the new generation of veterans.
Mm-hmm.
We're giving them the opportunities and the contact that we really didn't have when my generation got out. The
Yeah.
Vietnam Veterans of America has a slogan saying, "Never again will a generation of veterans ignore the next generation of veterans." And there's a lot of truth to that.
Absolutely.
So we're outreach to the Iraqi, the Afghan veterans, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Enduring Freedom. We're making sure that if they need help, they need assistance, they know where to contact us, and we're there for them.
Absolutely. And how have those experiences impacted your outlook on military service and war?
Well, I have two nephews, one's in the Army, one's in the Marines, both facing possible deployment in the next few months. And I worry for them. You have to work because I've been there, I know what war is like.
Mm-hmm.
Their father, my brother, there's one brother of mine who served, because Ray followed me into the Air Force. So he's concerned about his, because there's only two sons, and one or both could be sent off to combat theater. So,
Yeah, I would imagine that's something that keeps you up.
it does, because I want them to come back safe, I want to come back in one piece.
Right. And that leads into our next question, that future generations will see this interview. And what would you like them to know?
I'd like them to know that service to the country is something that should not be taken for granted. It's something that you want to do, you have to be in a mindset to do it. Since we don't have the draft anymore, everybody's enlisted, so it's the people who really have a desire to serve the country who are going in these days.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully when they get out, they'll still continue to serve the country in some capacity.
Yeah, that's a high level of commitment that one must put themselves in for something like that. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I don't regret having gone in. Like I said, I wish I had done something else and I would have stayed in longer. But it was an interesting experience. I got to see parts of the country and parts of the world I obviously never would have seen otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Government keeps sending me to California for some reason. They sent me, my first posting with the Air Force was at Hamilton Air Force Base, Marin County, up in the Bay Area. My first posting with the Weather Service was in Bakersfield, here in the San Joaquin Valley. So every time the government hires me, they say, "You're going to California." Whether you know where Bakersfield is or not, you're going. And believe me, when I got my first posting with the Weather Service, I had no idea where Bakersfield was, other than when Johnny Carson made jokes about it.
Right. And did you find that a lot of what you had experienced and learned in your time in the Air Force helped you in your position at work?
I would say it did, because I worked my way up through the lead forecast position, which means that I was in charge of the shift, and it drew on my experiences as the NCOIC, non-commissioned officer in charge of the line shacks in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Back when I had people working under me then, how to treat people, not to treat people, which is equally important.
Absolutely.
You cannot say, you will do this, this, and this. But at the same time, you can't let them run roughshod over you either. You have to be able to strike a balance. And I'd say that the experience in the Air Force helped me to strike that balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see that in other people in various occupations who haven't served, who really don't have the ideal people skills that you would gain from military training.
Right. And that's a strong quality to carry with you. It's an admirable quality to carry with you in your daily routine. So you said that that's helped you in your daily lives ever since then, correct?
Yes, definitely, because I don't think if I hadn't had the experience as head of a line check, I would be as comfortable delegating authority and making sure that the job got done by the people who were supposed to be able to do the job.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Sanger, thank you so much for taking this time for this interview. And above all, thank you for your service to this country.
You're welcome, and it was an honor to be part of this project.
Thank you, sir. Okay, let's talk about some of
I had
the...
mentioned my first posting with the Air Force was at Hamilton Air Force Base, and that was with the 41st Aerospace Rescue Recovery Squadron. And that was during the first few manned Apollo missions,
Yes.
the moonshots, 11, 12, and 13. And the 41st covered the Eastern Pacific aboard area. That was the area about halfway from the coast, halfway to Hawaii. And the first, so I was part of that for the Apollo 11, and Apollo, in fact, Apollo 11 was about 6 weeks after I got to Hamilton. And Apollo 12 in November of '69. And then remember the first inkling we had about Apollo 13 and the troubles they had there aboard that spacecraft was when the alert horn went off in the barracks. We got ready for possible deployment to the Indian Ocean for an emergency return. Luckily, we weren't needed. But
That's a pretty impressive nail to hang your hat on right there. Not everybody can say they've done that.
yeah, well, I was just on the part of the ground crew. We just got the planes airborne, but it was something that really didn't get a lot of publicity because nobody wants to really think about emergency returns.
True.
41st also has a distinction of having been mentioned in the book, The President's Plane is Missing, the novel by Robert Serling, brother of Rod. In fact, I think it's the only Air Force squadron that I've come across mentioned by name that I have any familiarity with. Usually they make up a name, but 41st was such a well-known squadron in the early to mid-60s that certainly used that as an actual squadron in his book. And then after I got out, went to Dover, Delaware, worked on F-106s at the 95th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. And again, the squadron got offhand mentioned in another book. The book Almost Midnight by Martin Caden. He talks about an F-106 squadron stationed on the coast near Washington, D.C., and there were only two at the time, the 95th and the 48th down at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. I don't think they'd be smug enough to think that he was referring to the 95th. You know, he didn't mention a specific number.
That's interesting.
It's the people in the Air Force squadrons, the Air Force personnel, we were getting favorable publicity at the time from the people who knew about the aviation. Robert Serling was a famous aviation writer. The President's Plane Missing was his first attempt at fiction. Made a not so bad movie out of it, although our squadron wasn't mentioned in the movie version.
Oh, it wasn't?
No.
Oh.
They can only put so much in 96 minutes.
Yeah, very true.
And so but those are about the only two instances I can recall that squadrons that I was specifically in got any sort of recognition in the fictional world.
Right.
And let's see, another thing is that I was looking at one day, because veterans go up to summer school for Veterans Day each year, talk about our experiences. And I was looking at the number of engines on the aircraft I worked at. When I was at Hamilton, I worked on 4-engine aircraft. When I was in Vietnam, I worked on twin-engine aircraft. When I was at Dover, I worked on single-engine aircraft. You notice a progression? 4, 2,
Yes.
1. Is that, I wondered, was my next post going to be a glider facility? Probably not, although the Air Force does have a few gliders.
Downsizing everything. That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
And that's another thing that I love doing is going off to talk about with the kids about what veterans do or experiences, not necessarily combat experiences, because I think that's a little bit too intense for young kids.
Mhm.
But just to let them know about life in the military, there's a good career move.
So do you follow the space program as well?
You know, back when there was a space program.
Uh,
It was 5 years ago that the last shuttle landed, and there hasn't been anybody go up an American rocket since.
mhm.
I do follow space.com occasionally, if there's anything good going on. Although these days, there's more and more embedded ads, it kind of turns me off.
Yeah.
That's true of just about any website these days. But I do think though that social media has been a big help for the military, trying to keep them in contact. I know my one nephew, he's forever tweeting with his folks. He does Facebook posts periodically, let us know how things are going. And I wish we had that back when I was in. Way to be able to stay in contact with friends, with family.
Mhm.
Getting one letter a week, assuming even the mail takes that short period of time back then to get to you.
It's got to be a great boost to morale to be able to.
It is, and then there's the USO with their one phone call a month, so you had 3 minutes to say hi, everything's going, bye, talk to you next month.
Those were long days in between those months, wasn't it?
That's one of the reasons why I chose my R&R to be in Hawaii. Although occasionally I kick myself into taking Australia, which was the other option. Because I could get on the phone and actually talk to the family for a long period of time. Let them know that, hey, I'm still alive. I'll be getting out or at least back to the world in 3.5 months.
Mm.
But for the days of Skype and all this other fun stuff that these days, you just click on a tablet or a laptop, just 30 seconds later you're talking to somebody halfway around the world.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome.
And kids take it for granted. I mean, I look at my niece, she had her first smartphone when she was something like 7 or 8 years old. I think that's way too early, but she's a whiz at it.
Right.
Me, I still work with an old flip phone, and I ain't even got a smartphone. I refuse to have a phone that's smarter than I am.
Aren't we all? Well, thank you, Gary, again, for
You're
everything,
very welcome.
for sharing your stories with us.